First of all, the whole world has enormous interest in China. I believe that most of you are familiar with the geography of China and where is that province called Xinjiang located. It's on the northwest of China, whereas development has happened much more on the southeastern flank or eastern flank. And so this is a region which still remains relatively underdeveloped, and it is also a region which is sparsely populated, and it has largely minorities living in, and this is the region where Muslims largely live, and particularly Uyghur Muslims live. So discussion today is going to be on this case of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang region or Xinjiang autonomous region of China, which you see in the next map now has borders with 6 neighboring countries. And you can see, of course, Afghanistan and Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Mongolia. So it's in that sense linked with the neighboring countries as well, which also are countries where Muslim populations are largely living. So that makes it perhaps a little unique part of this rising and powerful China, which is where the world has been lately discussing the issues of human rights or human rights violations, shall we say. And human rights, I'm putting these 2 little slides to showcase how the pictures sometimes give you different imaginations of how the world or various civil society activists in the world have been imagining as to how should they assert or reclaim human rights. And on 10th of December, of course, which is observed as Human Rights Day, such debates and such initiatives particularly come to light. First of all of you fully know that 10th of December is adopted as a Human Rights Day because on this day in 1948, United Nations General Assembly had adopted the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And what is important to begin with as an academic or as students to understand is that human rights are fundamentally supposed to be inherent. They are not given by anybody, but they are inherently part of human civilization or human existence. So they are inherent to humans. And no state is being a benefactor when it gives those basic human rights to its citizens. So they are inherent. They are also universal. At least large component of basic human rights are universal. They cannot be so much contextualized that the basic human rights in one society will be different from the other. They are also supposed to be inalienable. They are part of human existence. If humans exist, so do the basic human rights. And of course, also they must be non-discriminatory. You cannot make distinction between the level of development or any other yardstick to say we will have different numbers or different levels or different kinds of human rights in different societies. All states by now have signed and ratified at least one of the 9 basic human rights treaties around the world. So there is some kind of basic consensus on these issues. All 9 have not been signed by all countries as of now. But even when they begin to accept and ratify one of them, they must then, based on that commitment, the states, all states must respect basic human rights. They also must protect basic human rights. And thirdly, they must also fulfill all those basic conditions in which the protection and respect of human rights is demonstrated by these states. But reality of the world around us is that there is absolutely no nation that has not been accused of human rights violations. Different groups of people, different associations, different organizations have made assessments about different countries. But there won't be any country which can say that absolutely no one has criticized that country of human rights violations. So in that sense, one faces this problem, which is almost global as well. But today, we are discussing the human rights issues which world is debating about China, and particularly about Xinjiang, or even within Xinjiang, of Uyghur Muslims. And that we are discussing because on this year's Human Rights Day, on the eve of Human Rights Day, a Uyghur Tribunal based in London has come out with a report. And that report is circulating in the media, and that media is debating about this issue of human rights issues in Xinjiang in relationship to Uyghurs. And you can see this photo showing Uyghurs in what China calls internment camps. And you see, notice this picture, you already know President Xi Jinping. So why on this year's Human Rights Day we chose to discuss Xinjiang as a case for us is because this Uyghur Tribunal, which is an independent civil society initiative based in London, has come out with a report ruling that China has committed genocide, which is a very serious indictment, genocide against Uyghurs and some other ethnic minorities in its autonomous region of Xinjiang. The report also accuses China's top leaders, including President Xi Jinping, of what is called primary responsibility for such acts of controlling Uyghur population. Usually genocides, indictments happen when a particular country is killing a lot of people, or at least showing an intent of killing a lot of people of a cultural or ethnic group. But here, indictment is about controlling population with forced sterilizations, etc., blaming the top leadership. Of course, the tribunal says, while the acts of rape, torture, etc., may not be carried out in that great detailed knowledge of President Xi Jinping, but his politics, his language, his speeches have definitely encouraged and promoted such activities in China. Now, they also indirectly allude to the fact that in a country, which is China, where hierarchies are very rigid, parties' control on infrastructure, both social and physical infrastructure and bureaucracies, is very strong. Now, it is not easy, or it is not possible to believe that such activities have been going on for years and years without implicit or explicit authority from the top itself. So at least indirectly, they are indicting the top leadership in this case. Now, this tribunal has been active only for the last 1 year. It was set up by an advocate, Mr. Neese. He's a British barrister, and he was requested, he was urged by basically Uyghur activists around the world to set up such a tribunal. And it has been going on hearing and doing research on these issues, involving a sort of group of lawyers and academics. And that at the end of the year, it has come out with this report. Now, as this tribunal was working, some reports and news about it was already coming out. We also realized that it is not a state initiative of United Kingdom. And therefore, Chinese off and on were saying that this tribunal has no legal sanction, no powers of enforcement, and it is just wholly independently working on, driven by Mr. Neese. And therefore, in that sense, when Chinese were imposed sanctions by Great Britain in the name of human rights violations, and China responded by also putting sanctions on various people in Britain, they also placed such sanctions on Mr. Neese, who had started this tribunal. In September itself, the Chinese ambassador in the UK, you can see his picture, Chen Chiguang, he had said that this tribunal is a reflection of what he called political manipulation aimed at discrediting China. Of course, not just the tribunal, United States has also been talking about China, having human rights violations. Likewise, China also annually publishes a report of human rights violations in the United States. But the highest number of internments or internment re-education camps or detentions, depending on different countries using different words, United States State Department has given a highest figure of 2,020,000 Uyghurs, they believe, and other minorities have passed through what they call sprawling network of detention centers in Xinjiang over a period of time, undergoing re-education, as Chinese would like to say. But the former detainees, often interviewed in various media, including this tribunal, have alleged that they were subjected to rigorous political indoctrination. Of course, also forced labor and sometimes torture and sexual abuse also. But if you look at the other side, the Chinese would usually talk in terms of cultural assimilation, but people have also accused China of forced sterilizations of Uyghurs to control their population. Now, led by United States, several of its friends and allies, including, for example, United Kingdom, European Union, Canada, Netherlands, have also seen their national legislatures passing various resolutions talking about China's genocide in Xinjiang, particularly talking of Uyghur Muslims. The US Secretary of State, for example, recently, Antony Blinken, you see his photograph also on top, has accused China of crimes against humanity, which again is indicating the same language of genocide against the Chinese. Now, so much so that there has also been campaign that Chinese are going to host Winter Olympics next November next year, and that countries have been talking about that they all should boycott in order to highlight the issue of Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang facing certain difficulties by the Chinese regime. So United States has only recently spoken about formally declaring that their official delegations will not be participating in Winter Olympics. But likewise, some of the other friends and allies also, US and UK, Australia, Canada, have also announced that their official delegations will not be going to China for Winter Olympics next year, to highlight this issue of human rights violations. Now, China's facing such a campaign is not new. United Nations Human Rights Commission or United Nations State Department, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, they have been periodically coming out with their assessments and reviews about China's human rights track record and its situation on the ground, and often indicting China of various things that they believe Chinese are doing. Most of them have been accusing China of various regular illegal acts of harassment of minorities, intimidation, detentions, arrests, or mishandling of even the death penalty laws. Many of them have also highlighted how China, because of its one-party rule, have defied what are seen as basic minimum norms in the Western democratic societies or systems. For example, they believe that one-party system defies the principle of checks and balances or separation of powers, which means Chinese, according to them, do not have independent judiciary, do not have freedom of expression or protest, etc. And they speak it from their perspective of liberal democracies. Now, more recently, for example, 2 days ago, on 8th of December, United Nations House of Representatives have passed a bill called Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. Now, that is apparently proposing to ban all import of goods that are originating in Xinjiang of China. And this bill is now going to go to the upper house or the Senate, and then, of course, to the president for his signatures. Likewise, last year also in June, for example, President Trump's administration had also passed something called Uyghur Human Rights Policy Act, directing various United States agencies to constantly report on these human rights violations in China's Xinjiang Autonomous Region. Trump's National Security Advisor, of course, last year published a book after he demitted office and had claimed, very interestingly, saying that President Trump himself on 2 occasions had actually told President Xi Jinping to go ahead with his plans of Uyghur internments in Xinjiang, which is a contradiction in terms as to how a certain campaign of human rights is going on led by United States, and how could President Trump be saying this or sanctioning such an activity by President Xi Jinping. Now, we understand that world's most powerful body is United Nations Security Council. But we also know that Chinese sit there, and it is not easy to take these issues to United Nations Security Council. But we also understand that Chinese have signed the 1966 International Convention on Civil and Political Rights. China has not ratified it. China is the only one of the permanent 5 of UN Security Council not to ratify it. But Chinese have also signed and ratified International Convention on Economic, Political and Cultural Rights. And we are talking here of cultural rights also in specific. So Chinese had signed that in 1997 and ratified again in 2001. Now China responded now when the report came yesterday, saying that the Uyghur Tribunal based in London has no legal standing. It's a civil society initiative, but it also accused this tribunal of having received funding, as they claim, up to $250,000 US from World Uyghur Congress based in the United States, and likewise several other Uyghur organizations. And therefore, they are saying this is kind of ordered report, and it's not kind of as objective as one would expect it to be. And yes, the tribunal has accepted having received similar amounts of money. They have not said how much money. And they believe that people on the top of decision making, the lawyers and academics who were leading the tribunal, they were not taking any honorarium at all. They were just trying to establish the facts on the ground on their own. But they used this money to fly in various people who were coming to give their versions to the tribunal, or people who were doing younger junior people doing research in finding facts out about the situation. But they have said yes, the tribunal did receive money from World Uyghur Congress and other Uyghur organizations. Now we also need to perhaps understand that China seems to define human rights very differently compared to most of the Western narratives on how human rights are understood and conceived of. The Chinese have always emphasized much more on economic, then social, and then, of course, political rights. And they have defined these economic, social, political in that hierarchy, rights in relationship to what they call national culture. Not a specific culture based on various ethnic communities, but the Chinese national culture. And they also define it by linking it to the levels of development in a given cultural context or societal context. And they have constantly claimed that the situation on the ground, as far as human rights are concerned, in China has been constantly improving. But they, of course, believe that the existing arrangements are there, and Chinese are always constantly working towards ensuring basic human rights for all the Chinese citizens. They give various examples. Chinese would, for example, say that Chinese one-child policy has been another issue of debate around the world. But as late as till 2015, Chinese had made assumptions, as they claim, that minorities were not supposed to be under the purview of one-child policy. But the bigger example China today throws up to the world is to say how they have lifted more than 800 million people, not 800 people as the slide says here, 800 million people out of poverty. And last year, 10 years before the Millennium Development Goals or Sustainable Development Goals, they have a target of 2030 for eliminating world's acute poverty. China claimed that they have eliminated China's acute poverty last year. So they say that this is how they are kind of empowering their citizens and providing them facilities to have better life and more fulfilled life for themselves. You also need to understand that China also has its own supporters. There are countries that are not opposing China, and there are countries that are staying silent on such criticisms. There are countries that abstain from such resolutions being passed in various forums, or sometimes they even support China, that China's version is more effective. An easy example would be the two very important resolutions in 2018 and 19 on this issue, and that were adopted in UN General Assembly. And one can notice very clearly on your own as to which were the countries opposing it, which were countries abstaining from it, and who were the countries supporting, or who were the countries leading that campaign. So China is not totally isolated. It does have countries that are either supporters or countries that are sympathizers, so they stay silent on these issues in places like UN General Assembly. And UN General Assembly is important because when you cannot take decisions in UN Security Council, The UN General Assembly usually is the place where you try to take those issues of stalemate. Now, along with this report that came yesterday of Uyghur Tribunal, another interesting report which perhaps has not received as much attention around the world is how Nicaragua, a country in Latin America, has switched its official recognition from Taiwan to China, Taiwan to mainland China. And this leaves about just 14 very small countries, Taiwan. Until 1970, only about 36 countries were recognizing the Communist China or the People's Republic of China. Today, the whole world actually recognizes mainland Communist China as the real China. And this is an example. That report also came exactly yesterday. And Nicaragua perhaps is the largest country among those 13 or 14 countries that are left now, which recognize Taiwan. So in that sense, China's influence and engagement with the world is also constantly increasing. Of course, United States remains the main flag bearer of talking about violations of human rights in China. But we also need to understand that in face of China's rising stature, both in case of big powers or even middle powers raising this issue of human rights violations, of course, it becomes interesting because China is rising. China is always in news around the world. So big powers that feel that China is undermining their power and stature in international community or in international affairs or international decision making, they find it very useful to arm twist China using this campaign of human rights violations in China. But rise of China, if that makes it interesting to talk about violations, it also makes it equally difficult to act upon and to push China or punish China as they would like to do, because rise of China also means China has enormous leverages. So China, for example, has seen that powerful nations like United States or its friends and allies, they are always in forefront of talking of human rights violations in China. But in reality, if you see, United States today has almost $1 trillion trade per year. $1 trillion trade per year with China. So they continue to engage China as well. All major powers today are also major trading partners of China simultaneously. So in that sense, what I want to underline is that their campaign for human rights violations in China has always been a subset of their China policy, which means when they have tensions with China, when they are angry with China, they raise these issues much more. When they do not have tensions with China, when they do not find that they are in trade war or technology war with China, then the same human rights violations become less important and these countries do not as much push forward these issues. Let us look at the second set of countries which should bear enormous responsibility, because we are talking of Uyghur Muslims in China, of whose basic human rights are being violated as the West is claiming. Then the onus lies also on countries that have largest Muslim population. Indonesia has the largest Muslim population, Pakistan has second, India has the third. Now, they are also conscious of their equations with China. They also have enormous trade with China. India's largest imports come from China. China is the provider of largest imports to India in spite of tensions of last 2 years. Plus, these countries like Pakistan, Indonesia, or India are also conscious of their own minorities. Now, if we take a particular stance about China's Muslims, what happens to these nations' own minorities, then of course those issues and comparison will also come to the forefront for the world studying them and talking about them. Then third set of countries are countries that claim to be flag bearers or spokespeople or spokespersons for the Muslim world. Then these are those nations. Islamic republics, for example. Saudi Arabia is the most powerful country in that. Turkey is another very powerful country. Malaysia, one could talk of Pakistan as well. And now these countries have not just said nothing about these issues. Some of them have gone to the extent of supporting China's internment camps. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, he is the prince of Saudi Arabia, but he is the de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. He's more than once sanctioned saying that President Xi Jinping's policies in Xinjiang are legitimate. Prime Minister Imran Khan was recently asked this pointed question as to what happens in your most friendly country, China's Xinjiang province. And he kind of showed ignorance. He said, I don't know if there is any issue in Xinjiang. So can you imagine that a Prime Minister says, I don't even know what is happening in Xinjiang, whereas he's completely, English educated, educated in Oxford. He's in touch with the Western world. He's constantly reading and listening to what Western world is saying. And he says, I have no idea what are you talking about. Same as Malaysia. Turkey was another major destination. In 1950s, Uyghurs used to seek asylum in Turkey. Almost till 2008, Turkey was indeed critical of China in relationship to what was happening to Uyghurs in Xinjiang. But after coming of President and Prime Minister Erdogan, again, change of policy. And now Turkey doesn't speak about Xinjiang as well. Fifth set of stakeholders are those inside China. Are people and other ethnic minorities talking about these issues? No. The other very significant Muslim minority in Xinjiang is Hui Muslims. And Hui Muslims and many other minorities in China have over a period of time adapted to the Han Chinese or mainland China's cultural moorings, cultural rituals, adopted to the structures, and they seem to have assimilated in China. And President Xi Jinping since 2014 have been talking about his policy of ethnic assimilation. So in that sense, it's much more complex as you see how to turn indictments into action is something which we notice is extremely difficult. And therefore, these studies, campaigns and indictments like the one that comes out of tribunal, therefore begins to look like nothing more than lip service. And even that lip service, we believe, even bad publicity is publicity. So that brings certain amount of publicity, increasing influence, increasing visibility to China around the world. So even if you are talking negative, the world is constantly talking about China. And the people who have less interest in China would also know more about China. So for example, on Human Rights Day today, we could have discussed something else. But because of this issue in focus, even we are discussing what is happening to Uyghur Muslims in China in that sense. And let me very quickly underline another academic report which came recently from UK. And that is a very interesting report that tells us what could be the way forward. How we can move from indictments to action in case the Western world wants to move from indictments to action. UN Security Council, very clearly, as I mentioned earlier, is the most powerful body and takes actions in most situations. But here China holds a veto power inside United Nations Security Council, and therefore UN Security Council is not an option here. History also tells us that when UN Security Council has not been very, very active, comes in a stalemate situation, issues have gone to UN General Assembly. And in General Assembly, of course, perhaps onus lies on various influential middle powers or emerging economies or G7 or non-aligned countries, which have often used General Assembly's resolutions to push certain issues forward. And for example, during initial period of United Nations, during the first decade from 1945 to 1960, General Assembly and these countries played an enormous role in decolonization of the world, particularly decolonization of Africa. And so General Assembly has played, or UN peacekeeping was started in General Assembly because UN Security Council was not willing to agree on any of such resolutions. So onus therefore lies on middle powers, emerging economies. Second, perhaps possibility of where we can move from indictment to action is now in post-pandemic period. There is a whole that world needs to reorganize or redesign the supply chains or value chains or production chains because they realize there has been far too much dependence on China, particularly in the manufacturing sector, and they want to craft strategies where China's sort of overbearing presence in manufacturing sector can be reduced. And if other countries become relatively autonomous or independent in terms of economic manufacturing and services, their leverages to then push China to comply with certain norms that they want China to comply will perhaps increase. The chart on top of it shows you how in the world's manufacturing, China contributes nearly 30%. For one country, 30% manufacturing comes from China. That is why it is called the factory of the world. The next largest manufacturing country is United States, which is half of China, 16%. Next largest is Japan, 7%, one-fourth of what China does. So how to reduce this excessive dependence on manufacturing in China is where certain amount of advantage or leverages could increase of other countries, and then perhaps they could think of imposing sanctions. But at this stage, I think that leverages are very limited. Now, what this report that I'm talking about is this report called Laundering Cotton talks about going in for not big, bold initiatives like the tribunal in London would like the world to do, but on specific, incremental, almost imperceptible strategies where rest of the world can gradually begin to increase leverages against China and put restraints on China so that Chinese would begin to comply with norms and institutions and conventions that the Western world would like them to comply with. Now, this report has come from Sheffield Hallam University in UK, and it talks about how the example of cotton perhaps is perfect to understand what is happening and what can happen, and if nothing is happening, why nothing is happening. The report says that 5 top contractors of China are controlling this whole cotton production and export of China. Whether it is yarn or it is fabric or it is finished clothing, the suppliers are basically 5 dominant suppliers, and then they are supplying to the top 100 brands. But much of that cotton is produced in Xinjiang. 80% of China's cotton comes out of Xinjiang, and Uyghurs are predominantly involved, and people talk about forced labor there. That is why United States, as I mentioned, on 8th of this month has passed this bill in House of Representatives to ban import of products that are coming from China. But we also understand that China has interesting strategies. It does not simply supply these cotton products, whether it is yarn, fabric, or finished clothing, directly to the Western nations. 52% of that cotton, yarn, fabric, and other things go from China to intermediary nations like Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia, India, Pakistan, Kenya, Ethiopia, Mexico. And from there, then they further get refined or created into fine clothing for those international brands and then land in those Western countries. So when these Western countries like United States impose ban on imports of things coming out of Xinjiang, it's going to punish these countries because those exports come from these countries, Bangladesh, Vietnam, Philippines, Indonesia, Cambodia. So that makes it far more complex, whether they can put it, what happens, how much of impact it will have on China in that sense. So what we are seeing here is it's not easy to shift from indictments to action as the West would like to do, because the situation is complex, world is interdependent, and there are multiple stakeholders that will be punished in case any such blanket ban is placed. Indeed, this chart shows you how China has been encouraged. And even China's total production, you can see, has increased enormously when it is coming from Xinjiang. So cotton from Xinjiang has become increasingly attractive commodity for export in terms of China's exports. And it is using that in terms of demonstrating how development is happening in Xinjiang and how Uyghurs are getting employment, etc., etc. So China's total production of, you can see, cotton has now fallen below than the cotton production that is coming from only Xinjiang. So the two curves, two lines are showing you production from Xinjiang in red color, and in gray color, the other regions of China. So other regions of China have become less competitive. They have virtually given up on this production, whereas Xinjiang has become a kind of a hub of cotton production. So this is a great example of how cotton production itself can be a kind of issue area to study, how countries can gradually begin to create situation where they can ensure that if the West wants certain norms to be complied by China, how they can do that. So in the end, I think learning from this Xinjiang cotton case, to close my discussion, what we are learning here is that given China's enormous economic prowess, See, China is the only largest economy that has claimed positive growth during the pandemic year 2020. At end of 2020, Chinese have claimed that their GDP has crossed 100 trillion yuan, which is equal to 16 trillion US dollars. Enormous amount of GDP. India's GDP, by comparison, for example, is $2.7 trillion. For United States, GDP is $21 trillion in that sense. So, in comparison, so you can see how China's economic power is rising. And that power rising has resulted in enormous economic engagement, both in trade and investments. You must have heard about Belt and Road Initiative. So both the developed world, developing world, and the least developed countries are all getting enormously engaged with China in terms of their economic interests. Many countries see their own economic development tied to China's economic development increasingly. So one has to appreciate the limitations of why world or Western world is not able to move from indictments to action. So therefore, what I'm saying is that repeated such indictments begin to appear like a lip service or simply a far cry. What is important here, perhaps, is to create a far more holistic, wide-ranging, a spectrum of incremental, imperceptible small strategies, as the laundering cotton report suggests. And in doing that, I think all the stakeholders that perceive that there are violations happening in Xinjiang in China, and then they have certain norms and institutions that they want Chinese to comply, will have to begin by, first of all, promoting their own human rights records. So that these countries, when they frankly, openly speak on world forums about minorities in China, they're not worried about their own minority situations at home, that this could boomerang and world could talk about their own minorities. And then from there, build their gradual sort of leverages in economic terms, in terms of their political engagement with the rest of the world, so that they can gradually impel China to carry forward this campaign from indictment to action. But that is a long haul. And I do not see that if we work gradually, imperceptibly, that we will be able to achieve certain kind of compliance or leverages to push China to comply before at least one decade's time. Sometimes media makes headlines and sensation about, this indictment is going to, be a groundbreaking kind of exercise. I would be a little cautious in looking at these indictments and campaigns leading to immediate results. In case the Western world is really serious to push this forward, and I think in that case they have to really make sure that they have a long haul, which is where they should build strategies to ensure that their norms and institutions become respectable and strong enough for China to be socialized, co-opted, and then encouraged to comply with those norms. Until then, I think we will continue to live in circumstances of fluidity, where I think one nation, one group will continue to talk about human rights of other countries, and each will continue to sort of do this naming and shaming exercise, which does not lead to situation on the ground changing, whether it is in China or in any other country. So if world has to really move forward in changing the situation of people who are victims of human rights violations, that is an uphill task, and I think that needs thinking and strategies of a very different kind. Thank you. Let me stop here, and I look forward to any comments and questions.